We often wonder what separates the forgotten from the remembered, the discarded from the treasured, and how impossibly thin, that line can be. At 19 years old, Eliza Whitmore owned nothing but a wooden trunk, $3 silver, and the calluses on her hands. She had been cast out 4 years earlier by her own uncle, Silas Cobb, the man who took her in when her parents drowned and who decided, once she was old enough to earn her keep elsewhere, that she was no longer worth the trouble of feeding. All she had in the world was $11.40, saved penny by penny from years of mending fishermen's nets in the cold, and with it she did something the whole town of Gull Harbor, Maine, called foolish beyond reason. She bought the old abandoned lighthouse at Cormorant Point, dark and crumbling and in use for 11 years, for the sum of $9 at the county tax auction. Everyone assumed she had thrown her last coins into a pile of rotting stone. What none of them knew, what even Eliza herself could not have imagined as she pushed open that rusted iron door, was that sealed within those walls lay a secret that would not only transform her own fate, but restore something the entire town had believed lost forever to the sea. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Whitmore. If you're watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, or been told you were worth less than you knew yourself to be, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Eliza had been born in the spring of 1878, in a narrow saltbox house that looked out over the gray Atlantic from the edge of Gull Harbor, a fishing town of perhaps 600 souls tucked into the rocky coast of Maine, where the winters came early and the sea gave and took in equal measure. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, was a lobsterman, broad-shouldered and quiet, a man who spoke more to the tide than to people, and who taught his only daughter to read the sky the way other men read newspapers, the color of the clouds at dusk, the way gulls flew low before a storm, the particular hush that settled over the water when the wind was about to turn cruel. Her mother, Anne, had come from a family of sailmakers, and it was from her that Eliza learned the patient, exacting art of working with rope and canvas and thread, of coaxing order out of tangled lines, of mending what seemed beyond repair with nothing more than steady hands, and the refusal to give up on a thing simply because it looked ruined. These were not skills anyone considered valuable in a young girl meant for marriage and a quiet household, but Thomas Whitmore never saw it that way. He would sit Eliza on an overturned dory in the evenings and let her practice splicing lines until her fingers bled and then healed and then grew strong. And he would tell her, in that low voice of his, that the sea did not care whether you were a boy or a girl, only whether you understood her. It was this understanding of ropes, of knots, of patience, of the quiet dignity in unglamorous work that would follow Eliza through every hardship that came after, though she could not have known it then. She was, even as a small child, the kind of person the town noticed without quite acknowledging. The girl who fixed the church bell's frayed pull rope without being asked, who noticed when old widow Tanner's fence was leaning and quietly nailed it straight before anyone else saw the need. She was not loud, and she did not seek praise. She simply looked at what was broken and could not help herself from wanting to make it whole again. Her mother used to say that Eliza had been born with an old woman's patience in a child's body, and her father used to laugh and say that was exactly the kind of woman the sea respected. Their life was not wealthy by any measure the wider world would recognize, but it was, in the way that mattered to Eliza, abundant. They had a small boat named the Constance, after Eliza's grandmother, and a house with a good stove and a garden where her mother grew potatoes and rhubarb, and on Sunday evenings the whole family would walk out to Cormorant Point to watch the lighthouse keeper, an old widower named Obadiah Finch, light the great lamp as the sun went down. Eliza loved this ritual more than almost anything else in her childhood. She loved to climb up the spiral stairs when Mr. Finch allowed it, the smell of whale oil and brass polish, the way the beams swept out over the darkening water like a hand reaching to guide every fisherman home. Mr. Finch had no children of his own, and he took a particular fondness to Eliza, teaching her to read the Fresnel lens's great glass prisms, to understand the rhythm of the light's flashing pattern, to appreciate that somewhere out on the black water, a man's life might depend entirely on whether that lamp burned true. She did not know then how much those quiet evenings would matter later. She only knew that she loved him and loved the tower, and loved the feeling of being useful to something larger than herself. It was this childhood, steady, humble, rich in love, if not in coin, that gave Eliza the values that would carry her through everything that came after. That worth was not always visible on the surface, that patience could outlast almost any storm, and that the things people discarded were very often the things most worth saving. The turning came in the autumn of 1890, when Eliza was 12 years old. Her father and two other men from Gull Harbor took the Constance out past the shoals to chase a late run of mackerel, against the advice of the older fishermen, who did not like the look of the sky. The storm that rose that night was one the town still spoke of decades later, a nor'easter that splintered 3 boats against the rocks and drowned 7 men, among them Thomas, and 2 days later, from grief and exposure after wading into the frigid surf searching for him, and Whitmore as well. Eliza was left, at 12 years old, entirely alone, with no brothers, no sisters, and no living relative in Gull Harbor save her father's older brother, Silas Cobb. Silas Cobb was not, by any account, a cruel man in his public dealings. He was, in fact, well regarded in town, a clerk at the harbor office who dressed neatly and spoke with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that reputation was currency. But behind the door of the house he inherited along with his niece, he was a different man entirely, tight-fisted and cold, resentful of the mouth he now had to feed, and the child he saw not as family, but as an obligation forced upon him by his brother's carelessness. He sold the Constance within a month, claiming the money would go toward Eliza's keep, though she never saw so much as a new pair of shoes from it. He rented out the salt box house her parents had built and moved Eliza into 2 rooms above the harbor office instead, where she slept on a cot and was made to understand, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that she was a burden being tolerated rather than a child being loved. He put her to work as soon as she was able, mending nets for the fishing fleet, taking and sewing, scrubbing the floors of the harbor office, and every cent she earned, he collected for himself, calling it fair payment for her room and board. Eliza endured this for 4 years, not because she did not understand its injustice, but because she had nowhere else to go and no one who would take her part against a respected man like Silas Cobb. She grew quiet and watchful in those years, the way people do when they have learned that complaint changes nothing and dignity is the only thing left that cannot be taken. She kept her father's old, knot-tying skills sharp by practicing alone at night, and she kept her mother's patience with needle and thread because these are the only inheritances Silas Cobb had not managed to sell. Then, in the spring of 1894, when Eliza turned 16, Silas informed her, without warmth, without apology, that she was old enough now to make her own way, and that he could no longer justify the expense of housing her. He gave her, as a final gesture, $2 and the address of a boarding house in the next town over, and he shut the door of the harbor office behind her without so much as a farewell. What followed were 3 years that Eliza rarely spoke of afterward. Years of moving from boarding house to boarding house along the Maine coast, taking in mending and laundry, sometimes going hungry, always saving whatever she could into a tin box she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, because she had learned early that money left in the open had a way of disappearing into other people's pockets. She was, by 19, a woman entirely alone in the world, with no family, no property, and no prospects beyond the next mending job. And yet she had never once let go of the quiet certainty her father had planted in her, that the things which looked worthless were very often not worthless at all, only overlooked. It was this certainty, more than any real plan, that brought her back to Gull Harbor in the autumn of 1897, drawn by a piece of news that reached her secondhand. The county was auctioning off the old Cormorant Point Lighthouse, decommissioned years earlier when a newer, steam-powered light was built on the far side of the bay, and left to rot ever since old Obadiah Finch had died, alone and unmourned by anyone but Eliza, back in 1886. She arrived in Gull Harbor with $11.40 to her name, sewn into the lining of her coat, and she stood at the edge of the auction crowd on a gray October morning and watched as no one, not one soul in the entire town, offered a single bid for the crumbling tower on the point. The county assessor, a tired man eager to be rid of the property and its unpaid taxes, finally looked out over the silent crowd and asked, almost in jest, whether anyone would take it for $9, simply to close the books. Eliza's hand went up before she had fully decided to raise it. The crowd laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular pity reserved for those who do not yet understand how the world works. A young woman alone, spending nearly everything she owned on a ruin nobody else wanted. She paid her $9, took her deed, and walked the 2 miles out to Cormorant Point with the wind cutting through her coat, telling herself that at the very least it had a broken hinge, and inside, the spiral staircase was thick with dust and the droppings of nesting birds who had long ago claimed the upper gallery as their own. But Eliza, standing in that cold, echoing tower with the last light of the day, slanting through a cracked window, did not see ruin. She saw the same room she had climbed as a child at Obadiah Finch's side, and something in her chest loosened, just slightly for the first time in years. She spent that first night wrapped in her coat on the ground floor, and in the morning, with nothing else to occupy her hands, she began to clean. It was on the third day, while scrubbing the soot from the inside of the old lamp room at the top of the tower, that Eliza noticed something odd about the brass housing beneath the great lens's pedestal. A seam that did not match the rest of the fixture, a hairline gap where the metal met the stone in a way that seemed too deliberate to be decay. She worked at it with a bent nail for the better part of an hour before a small panel gave way, revealing a shallow cavity built into the base of the pedestal itself, clearly the work of a craftsman rather than an accident of age. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with time, she found a leather-bound logbook, its pages swollen but legible, and beneath it, a small iron strongbox, locked, far too heavy for its size. Eliza sat back on her heels in the fading light, her heart beating hard against her ribs, and understood, with the same certainty her father once had about weather, that she had found something Obadiah Finch had wanted very badly not to be found by the wrong person. She did not open the strongbox that first night. She was, if nothing else, a patient woman, and something told her the logbook needed reading first. By candlelight, seated on the cold stone floor with her coat pulled tight around her, Eliza began to read the private words of the man who had once taught her to love that tower, and what she found inside changed the shape of everything she thought she knew about Gull Harbor. The logbook was not, as she had first assumed, simply a keeper's record of tides and weather and ships past. Roughly 2/3 of the way through its pages, dated to the autumn of 1871, Obadiah Finch's careful hand shifted into something more urgent, more private, and Eliza realized she was reading a confession he had never intended anyone to see, or perhaps had intended exactly one person, someday, to find. He wrote of the great storm of that year, one Eliza had heard spoken of only in passing by older townsfolk, in which the fishing schooner Prudence had gone down with all 12 hands aboard, leaving behind a dozen widows and more than 30 children with no means of support. In the aftermath, the town had come together, as coastal towns did, to establish what they called the Mariners' Aid Society, a common fund into which every boat owner and merchant in Gull Harbor contributed a portion of their earnings, meant to be held in trust and distributed to families ruined by the sea's cruelty. By the winter of 1871, the fund held, according to Finch's careful accounting, just over $4,000, an enormous sum for a town of its size, entrusted to the harbor office for safekeeping under the stewardship of a young clerk newly risen to the position of assistant harbor master, a man named Elias Cobb. Eliza's hands went still on the page when she read the name. For Elias Cobb, she knew from scattered mentions over the years, was Silas Cobb's own father, dead now some 15 years, but whose name still carried a certain respectable weight in Gull Harbor's memory, remembered as an efficient and dutiful public servant. Obadiah Finch's account told a different story. He wrote that in the spring of 1872, barely 5 months after the fund was established, Elias Cobb came to him quietly, late one night, and confessed that he had made what he called unfortunate investments with a portion of the society's money, gambling it away in shipping ventures that had failed, and that nearly half the fund was gone. Rather than confess this publicly and face the ruin of his reputation and likely imprisonment, Elias Cobb had begged Finch, who as lighthouse keeper held a position of trust but no formal authority over town finances, to help him conceal the shortfall. Finch, to his everlasting shame as he wrote it, agreed, not out of loyalty to Cobb, but out of a desperate wish to protect the widows and children who depended on that fund from the panic and despair that would follow news of its theft. Together, the two men staged a small, controlled fire in a corner of the harbor office's records room, destroying the original ledgers and allowing Elias Cobb to claim, with feigned grief, that the society's records, and a significant portion of its funds, said to have been kept in cash pending investment, had been lost in the blaze. What the town never knew was that the remaining money, some $2,200 in gold coin that Elias Cobb had not yet squandered, was never destroyed at all. Fearing that Cobb, having proven himself capable of theft once, would eventually steal the rest as well, Obadiah Finch had taken the strongbox from the harbor office himself, under cover of night, and hidden it inside the one place he alone controlled and no one else had reason to search, the base of the great lamp he tended every evening at Cormorant Point. He wrote that he had intended, for years, to find a way to return the money quietly to the town, but that doing so would require exposing Elias Cobb's theft, and by then Cobb had grown powerful enough, and Finch old and isolated enough, that he feared no one would believe an agent keeper's word over respected harbor officials. Finch's final entry in the logbook, dated only weeks before his death in 1886, expressed his hope that someday, someone honest, someone who understood, as he put it, that value is not always where the world expects to find it, would discover what he had hidden, and would have the courage he himself had lacked to see it return to the families it was always meant to protect. Eliza read that final line 3 times by candlelight, and something in her chest, some old ember of grief for her parents and anger at the uncle who had discarded her, caught and steadied into something else entirely. A sense of purpose, so clear it felt almost like her father's voice reading the weather. She understood, with growing unease, that the strongbox in her hands did not merely represent old money. It represented proof that Silas Cobb's own father had stolen from the very town that trusted him, and that Silas himself, whatever his personal cruelties toward her, might have inherited more than just a name from that theft. He had, in fact, inherited the harbor office's records and reputation, and had built his own respectable standing atop a lie his father told 40 years before. The strongbox itself, when Eliza finally forced its rusted lock 2 days later with a borrowed chisel, held $2,200 in gold coin, exactly as Finch's log had promised, along with a folded letter in Elias Cobb's own hand, a private admission of guilt, written to no one in particular, perhaps only to himself, that Finch had apparently kept as insurance. Eliza sat with the gold spread before her on the cold stone floor of the lamp room, the sea wind moaning faintly against the glass, and understood that she now held in her hands both a fortune and a danger, for money stolen and hidden for 25 years does not return to the light without disturbing everyone who has built their life atop its absence. Word travels fast in a town of 600 souls, and it did not take long for Gull Harbor to learn that the strange young woman who had bought the ruined lighthouse for $9 had found something inside it. Eliza had tried to be discreet, carrying the strongbox to the town's one bank in a burlap sack rather than announcing her business. But the teller who weighed the gold could not help but mention the astonishing sum to his wife that same evening, and by the following market day, the story had grown, as stories do, into something both larger and stranger than the truth. Some said she had found a pirate's hoard, others that she had struck an oil deposit beneath the point, and a few of the older fishermen, those who remembered the prudence and the fun that vanished with her, began to ask quiet questions about whether the money's origin had anything to do with that long-ago fire. It was Silas Cobb, now a man of 52 and the town's harbor superintendent, comfortable and respected after decades of careful reputation building, who arrived at Cormorant Point 3 days later, uninvited, his carriage rattling up the rutted lane with an urgency Eliza had never once seen him show for her welfare as a child. He did not embrace her or ask how she had fared in the years since he cast her out. He asked, instead, in the clipped tone she remembered too well, what exactly she had found, and whether she understood that as her only living blood relation and former guardian, any property discovered on land she owned rightfully belonged, at minimum in part, to the family. Eliza, who had spent 3 days deciding exactly how she would meet this moment, did not raise her voice. She simply told him she had found a logbook and watched the color drain from his face before she had said another word. For Silas Cobb had grown up in that house, and some part of him, some old inherited unease, had clearly always known there was a debt his father left unpaid. What followed was not a single confrontation, but a slow, grinding campaign that unfolded over the following weeks. Silas Cobb, terrified of the ledger's contents becoming public and unraveling the respectability his family had built atop his father's crime, first tried persuasion, offering Eliza a modest sum to hand over both the gold and the logbook quietly, framing it as a private family matter best kept from town gossip. When she refused, he shifted to intimidation, using his position as harbor superintendent to spread doubt about her character among the merchants and boat owners whose goodwill she would need to survive in Gull Harbor, suggesting to anyone who would listen that a woman alone, showing up with a fortune in gold and wild stories about hidden money, was more likely a swindler than an honest finder. Several of the town's more cautious residents began to eye her warily, unwilling to take the side of an outsider against a man whose family name had sat comfortably at the harbor office for 2 generations. Eliza felt the old, familiar sting of being disbelieved simply because she was young and poor and alone, the very isolation Cobb himself had engineered years before now being turned against her a second time. The lowest point came when Cobb, growing desperate as Eliza continued quietly gathering support from a handful of the town's oldest fishermen, men who remembered the prudence, who remembered their own mothers weeping over the fund that vanished, and who, upon hearing her account and seeing Elias Cobb's own confession in his handwriting, began to believe her, filed a legal claim asserting that as Eliza's former guardian, he retained rights to any property she acquired before the age of legal majority, a technicality he hoped a sympathetic county judge might honor rather than see a respected local family publicly disgraced. For a few sleepless nights, Eliza genuinely feared she might lose everything a second time, that the gold meant to restore the town might instead be swallowed into the same pocket that had swallowed it once before, and that she herself might once again be cast out, this time not merely from a house, but from the fragile new home she had built stone by stone inside that lighthouse. It was old Captain Amos Whitfield, one of the last living survivors of the Prudence's crew of that era, and a man Eliza's father had once sailed alongside, who finally turned the tide. He had read Finch's logbook himself, in Eliza's presence, and recognized his own dead brother's name among the list of men lost, and recognized, too, with a grief that had waited 25 years to find its target, the shape of the lie that had been told to widows too devastated to question it. Captain Whitfield stood before the county magistrate not as a man defending a stranger, but as a man reclaiming his own family's stolen truth, and his testimony, steady, dignified, unshakable, did more to turn the town's sympathy than any argument Eliza herself could have made. The county magistrate, faced with Elias Cobb's own written confession and the corroborating testimony of Captain Whitfield and 2 other elderly residents who now recalled, with new clarity, the suspicious speed of the harbor office fire, ruled decisively. Silas Cobb's claim was dismissed, and more damningly, the ruling formally acknowledged on public record that the Mariners' Aid Society Fund had not been lost to fire in 1872, but diverted through the deliberate misconduct of the harbor office's then assistant superintendent. Silas Cobb did not go to prison. Too much time had passed, and the crime, ultimately, had belonged to his father rather than himself. But the respectable name he had spent his life polishing crumbled in a single afternoon, and he resigned his position at the harbor office within the month, leaving Gull Harbor entirely by the following spring, a quiet, unmourned departure that closed at last the long shadow his family had cast over the town. Eliza, for her part, wanted nothing to do with punishment for its own sake. What she wanted, and what she moved toward with the same steady patience her mother had once shown over a torn sail, was restoration. She did not keep the $20 to $100 for herself. though every soul in Gull Harbor would have understood if she had, given how dearly she had earned the right to some comfort. Instead, working alongside Captain Whitfield and a small committee of the town's oldest families, she re-established the Mariners' Aid Society exactly as it had been intended a quarter-century before, placing the recovered gold in a trust for the widows and children of fishermen lost at sea, with the first disbursements going, fittingly, to two aging women who had been young brides when the Prudence went down and had spent 25 years believing their husband's memory had been honored with nothing but an empty promise. She kept the Lighthouse for herself, and this, more than the money, was the true heart of what she had won back. With a small portion of the gold set aside for repairs, a decision the town unanimously and gratefully approved, given all she had returned to them, Eliza restored Cormorant Point Light to working order, replastering its walls, repairing the great lens, and though it would never again serve as an official navigational light, now that the newer steam-powered beacon across the bay had taken over that duty, she opened its lower rooms as a small museum and gathering place, where she kept Obadiah Finch's logbook on permanent display alongside a simple brass plaque bearing his final written words, so that no one in Gull Harbor would ever again forget the debt he had waited so long and so faithfully to see repaid. She lived there the rest of her days, tending a smaller lamp of her own each evening out of habit and reverence rather than necessity, mending nets for the fleet as she always had, and becoming, in time, the person the whole town instinctively turned to whenever something seemed too broken, too old, or too forgotten to be worth saving. We began this story by telling you that at 19, Eliza Whitmore had $11.40, and that she spent $9 of it on a ruin nobody else wanted. We told you that the town called it foolish, and in every practical sense, it was a gamble no reasonable person would have made, a bet placed on stone and rust, and the fading memory of a kind old man's evening ritual. But Eliza had learned, first from her father reading the sky over cold water, and later from 4 years of being treated as a burden by the one man obligated to love her, that the world is often deeply wrong about where value hides. She had been discarded once, at 12, by an uncle who saw only the cost of feeding her and never the worth of what she carried inside. The patience, the steadiness. The refusal to believe that broken things were beyond repair. It was that same unglamorous, overlooked inheritance that let her see promise in a crumbling tower everyone else had written off, and let her recognize, in an old man's hidden confession, not a burden but a sacred task. The gold she found was never really the treasure. The treasure was the chance to prove, finally and publicly, that she had been right all along, that she and the Lighthouse and the truth Obadiah Finch had guarded so faithfully were all worth far more than anyone in Gull Harbor had ever imagined. Thank you for spending this evening with Eliza Whitmore and the quiet shores of Gull Harbor. If her story moved something in you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people are so often the ones holding the greatest worth. We'd love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that the rest of the world had already written off. We read every story you leave us, and we're always grateful to sit with you in these quiet, lantern-lit corners of the past. Until next time, stay close.